My name is Harald Kleinberger-Pierer. I'm from the University of Applied Sciences, and I have some connections to the HPP, or I had connections to HPP. I was part of the diversity management of the gender department. Now I'm working at the University of Applied Sciences, first as a research assistant for the departments of health and medicine. So I support researchers in their proposals, support them for ethical or gender issues and so on. Second, I'm working on projects regarding open science, open innovation, as well as digital ethics. And third, I'm a historian, history of science from the 70s and 80th century. But I have to disappoint you a little. I will provide a historical seminar on this topic today, but I want to discuss a little or some aspects of scientific frauds or misconducts in science with some historical examples. But let's start with the present. I hope you will have very few direct experiences with scientific fraud or misconduct in general in your career. Maybe only listen to the definitions in a seminar on good scientific practice and ethics in science, or read it in the newspaper. Today, scientific misconduct or fraud is widely known and recognized in public and in the media. If scientific fraud, mainly plagiarism by famous people, is discovered or alleged, media and public have a vital interest in these cases. Violations against scientific practice via plagiarism, forging data, or other forms of fraud attract much attention and are discussed very extensively. But it is often stated, in general, only a tiny group of people in the scientific community is involved in misconduct or in fraud. How tiny this group is open for discussion, depending on the types of scientific fraud included in the statistics, as well as guessing on unrecorded cases. So let's make a short digression. You decide what's tiny for yourself. A review article from Daniel Fanelli, quite old one, but one most frequently cited in this matters, came to the conclusion that a little under 2% of all scientists admitted to having fabricated, falsified, or modified data or results at least once, based on different surveys. And additionally, 1/3 of all researchers have admitted other questionable research practice. Similar results can be found in a short report for Austrian and German researchers. It is based also here on self-declaration of researchers. I think you are aware that the results of such surveys are limited and must be interpreted with some care. But based on the self-declaration, 1/3 of researchers declare that they have observed forged or manipulated research or data. And here is a short breakdown per field. So please feel free to think about yourself if it's tiny, insignificant group that is related to scientific misconduct, or is it more irrelevant in size? But back to the news articles, like this short selection of statistics on fraud in science, the selection of news articles is not really representative. But it gives you some hints about what scientific misconduct can mean in practice. And you can see that there are different aspects on it. So therefore, before giving a short example of scientific fraud in the past or in the long history, I want to deepen a little our understanding of the different types of scientific misconduct. I choose, for obvious reason, the definitions of the Austrian Agency for Research Integrity. That was the last version was from 2015, but these definitions are also included in the new best practice guide for research integrity and ethics from last year. There are several types of scientific fraud. These first three are, I think, familiar to most of you. These are the classic or the traditional scientific fraud or misconducts. The fabrication of data, for example, the fabrication of research results, the falsification of data, for example, by manipulating the research process, and of course, plagiarism, which is defined as the wrongful appropriation of text, thoughts, or ideas from other persons. Besides these three traditional ones, there are several others, just to name some of them to get a better picture. The unjustified refusal to provide access to primary and original data, for example, not including information on how data was obtained or or something. And my favorite one, sabotaging research activities, is also the most brutal type of scientific misconduct of all. It means damaging or destroying experiments, equipment, documents, hardware, software, and other materials that another researcher requires to undertake his or her research. In addition, there are also some violations against good scientific practice. For example, republication, very important for cumulative PhDs. So read the guidelines here with some care, ask colleagues, persons you trust, read the editor's guidelines if not sure about the rules of republication. I think this very short overview will give you a first impression what is seen as scientific misconduct or similar. The definitions of scientific fraud or misconduct is updated from time to time and change a little. However, what was considered as scientific fraud is different in the past, going back 200 or 300 years ago, not 20 years. The types of scientific fraud and misconducts were not as clear as defined today. But in some aspects, we find some similarities today. The history of science, in the history of science, we have the great opportunity to research many of these cases of scientific misconduct of the last hundreds of years. On the other hand, it is difficult to reconstruct scientific misconduct after a long period of time. That is true for the examples I want to present here. That origin lies back more than 200 years, but it is also true when allegations are made regarding publications or research projects that maybe are only 10 or 20 years old. My intention is to provide some new perspectives on the definitions, insights in the practice of science or research, and an idea how scientific communities learned from scientific misconducts in the past. That's why I'm presenting you today some examples from an historical perspective, and as well as giving you small thesis on the history of scientific misconduct in the end as a starting point. My 4 examples will be separated in 2 sections. One talking about fabrication of research, and the second one about plagiarism and other misconducts. So let's jump to the first historical example, going a little back to this little fellow. He was fellow of the Royal Society, a famous geographer and map maker in the late 18th century and early 19th century. Against him, serious allegations were made regarding the fabrication of research. Today, the definition says fabrication of data, for example, the fabrication of research results like measurements, observation, and statistics. The artifact of Renel's fraud can be found here in this map on the left side. This map from 1798, made by Renel, shows the mountains of Kong, here in the red box highlighted, as well in a later version from another map maker. In case you're not an expert on African geography, comparing this with a current map, one thing becomes clear: the mountains of Kong do not really exist, but why they are included in this map. James Renel, who made this map, used geographical data collected from another famous traveler and geographer of his time, the famous Mungo Park, and adapted it a little, or forged it, so that this massive mountains range appeared on the map. It was very likely that it did not happen by mistake. Renel was experienced, highly trained, but still somehow he forged the data for the mountains. The obvious fraud here was done around 1800. This false information was then included in more than 80 other maps made in Europe. The fraud was detected more than 80 years later by another traveler and geographer, but maps showing the Kong Mountains were still printed up to the early 20th century. In hindsight, fraud or misconduct can often be detected easily. It is sometimes very obvious to see, like the whole mountains. But allegations have to be proven. This might require, for instance, that other correct data has to be collected. And in practice, this means that often a long time passes by until fraud and misconduct is discovered. That leads to my first thesis to historical frauds. there are only obvious frauds after they have been discovered. And that is especially true in this case. One question remains, why Renel succeeded with his fraud and the long-lasting wrong claim of the Kong Mountains? A very simple answer is trust. Science in the early modern times was largely built on the reputation, trust in the scientist itself. And Renel had a very high reputation, was seen as an expert on geography as well for the African continent. So he was generally trusted and nobody raised doubts about his claims of the Kong Mountains until definitive proof was available. Therefore, the Kong Mountains were included in maps for around 100 years. As today, reputation is important for scientific work and practice. This can also be a double-edged sword if wrong or insufficient claims are made by the most famous and most accepted scientists with large networks and high reputation. That is true here, in this case, and past and today. What is also true about this case, the case of Renel, is curious, a little insignificant, but an eye-catching simple example. But effects of the forging mountains of Kong were limited. Some maps were wrong, okay. Some students in geography had to learn these imaginary mountains, okay, but no harm was really done in reality. In another example, an historical example, the consequences or negative effects are quite long-lasting until today. Someone called it the most damaging medical hoax of the last 100 years. I'm talking about here Andrew Wakefield. Some or all of you might know him, and the fraudulent claim of the vaccine-autism connection. But let's start with a little chronology. Historians love them. In 1988, a 3-in-1 vaccine against measles, mumps, and rubella was introduced in Great Britain before it was also introduced in the US in the 1970s. In 1898, Wakefield and others make a publication in the Lancet identifying a new autism phenotype that was triggered by some environmental factors such as this vaccination. 2001, Daily Mail and other newspapers launched a campaign backing Wakefield and his claims about these connections. Later, another journalist, 2004, the Sunday Times, Brian Deere, reveals that the research has serious conflicts of interests. It came to light that lawyers representing patients with possible adverse reactions on vaccine were also supporting Wakefield and his studies with a bunch of money. 6 years later, however, the paper from 1998 was fully retracted, 6 years after delegation by several journalists and researchers were made, and 12 years after first publication. So half of an eternity for modern times between publication and retraction. Later, Wakefield and others were erased from the medical register in UK, found guilty of fraud, forging, and other misconducts or frauds. And later, research proved that no such claimed connection between autism and MMR could be detected in that way. So, put it in a nutshell, journalists, later researchers, lawyers, and other people put years of effort into finally proving that the study by Wakefield and others was fraud. Consequences, besides for the involved persons, significant drop of vaccination in this time. In England, for example, parents refused the MMR vaccine for their children, and the vaccination rates dropped from 91% in 1998, when the publication was made, to below 80% in 2003, when the campaign of the Daily Mail and other newspapers reached high. So it also may support, this fraud may be also supporting a revival of measles in England and other regions at this time. And in addition, until today, Wakefield is a prominent person in the anti-vaxxer groups and still provides a constant flow of misinformation and vaccination and other bullshit. But I think it is not for me as an historian to decide on this case. You are the expert in the field and can see what damage can be done with false or inaccurate information on medical treatments and vaccinations. If you want to learn more about this complex and long-lasting case, last year, this journalists starting the allegations against Wakefield's Brian Deere published a very comprehensive book on it. A simplified like positive thesis here might be that the history of scientific misconduct is the start to learn about the implications in the future. Now something completely different, again a not so serious case like this Wakefield case regarding the negative effects. It's a case about the scientific fraud of plagiarism and why cursing is allowed in research sometimes. Starting with the short definition for the day, plagiarism, which is defined as the wrongful appropriation of text, thoughts, or ideas from other persons. The history of plagiarism is quite complex in comparison to fabrication, data, or observation, which is quite clear through the centuries. Definitions of plagiarism differ over time. Sometimes copying was allowed, sometimes not, and not a really clear pattern can be seen overall. Maybe that's why the history of plagiarism is often an argument when plagiarism is detected today in older publications. Often heard, but it is a very weak argument for plagiarism or sloppy citations. When I wrote my thesis, the culture of citation and plagiarism were different. There is some truth in the statement, or that copying without indication was allowed in the past. Citation and scientific practice were different some 100 years ago, still a little different around 1900, slightly different 50 years ago, but very similar 20 to 30 years ago. And in addition, since 300 years, plagiarism itself in different types was not seen as a good scientific practice. We can find some historical definitions of plagiarism that are very similar to the current understanding. In, for example, Zedler's Encyclopedia, it's a German encyclopedia from the middle of the 18th century, we found one of the first definitions in German for plagiarism. Plagiarius literarius is named the scholarly thief by the scholarly community who writes down from others and claims as his or own work without indicating the author of the origin. Furthermore, the editor Zedler stated that plagiarism was common in his time and various scientific work on plagiarism had already been published. Plagiarism was so common in the past that even the editor, Zedler, of his encyclopedia himself did it. The definition of plagiarism itself was not originally written by Zedler, but can be found literally in another publication from the first half of the 18th century. So Zedler himself did not give any indication of the source for this article or in other articles. So it was so common that even the first definition in an encyclopedia in German was plagiarism itself, if we are taking the definition a little too literally. In addition, if plagiarism was detected in different fields of science in the 18th centuries and later, apart from encyclopedias, the reaction was similar like today, maybe with a little more polemic discussion and cursing. One well-documented case of plagiarism in the 18th century were the works of Johannes Kopp. Johannes Kopp was some kind of author and publisher of 15 publications, focusing mainly on law. His publications can be best described as handbooks. He translated Latin publications into German and added some comments of his own. In some of his publications, he forgot to mention that his works built substantially on former works in Latin, and he might have highlighted his contribution to the publications a little too much. The reaction to the publications and his plagiarism followed immediately after his first publications. Other scientists compared Kopp's publication with the Latin origins paragraph by paragraph, like plagiarism's detection software today, and they came to the conclusion that Kopp was not only a plagiarius literarius, but also that his translation were of bad quality and partly totally nonsense. Short footnote here, similarities with current cases of former ministers in Austria are a coincidence here, because Kopp never published on the topic Seepocken. So what makes this case so interesting is how plagiarism was seen and how harsh it was rejected by the scientific community in the modern times. Critics of Kopp and his plagiarism included It is the responsibility of the scientific community to pluck out porous plums of such growth, referring to Scop, or calling him a thief or a creep. Another critic suggests to retract Scop's publication and destroy them all, or recycle the paper, because paper was expensive at this time. So the reaction was harsh and not very polite. As a consequence, Scop was excluded from the scientific network and died 40 years after his last publication in poverty. So plagiarism was known and common in the past, but not very accepted in many fields of science. That leads to some kind of third thesis. Communication in science is based on mutual respect, except for fraud. When we compare this case of Scop's plagiarism with a more current affair, we can find some similarities. A recent case of scientific misconduct, recently for me as a historian, occurred 2008 at the Medical University of Innsbruck. I don't want to go into details of this case, but the allegations included ethical violations in the registration of clinical trials, misleading information for patients, honorary authorship, etc. So I want to talk about the reaction of the scientific community and the consequences, because they were quite similar to the case of Scop more than 200 years ago. We would not expect harsh words in scientific publications, but a note from the editors of Nature proves otherwise. They address and massively criticize not only the involved persons, but also the scientific community as a whole, in this case Austria, for not having done enough to prevent the scientific misconducts. To quote, "Austria is a small country and networks between power brokers are small and tight, but something, it seems, is rotten in the state of Austria." The message that the editors of Nature and the scientific community delivered to the Austrian community was clear. The scientific community in Austria reacted by finally founding an organization that takes care, or support research integrity, the so-called Austrian Agency for Research Integrity, whose guidelines and definitions I showed you in the beginning. Today, this agency has members of all public universities, University of Applied Sciences, colleges, research institutions, and I also think the research funding agency. The reactions of the scientific community and on the case in Innsbruck were similar to the case of Scop more than 100 years ago, with very harsh words, but some learnings from it also emerged. Before coming to my final statements, I want to address another aspect of scientific misconduct. As shown, the scientific community and public take scientific fraud or misconduct seriously. That's why we also should not only be aware of it, but also a little careful when allegations are made or discussed in public. While scientific misconduct certainly is a problem per se, it is also sometimes used as a weapon to discredit researchers without foundations. I want to give you only a little recommendations, Merchants of Doubt by Oreskes and Conway, with the informative subtitle, How a Handful of Scientists Obscured the Truth on Issues from Tobacco Smoke to Global Warming. And they're writing about a long-lasting strategy to obstruct research with allegations, public campaigns, lawsuits, etc. in the 20th century. Also, don't forget to apply the same carefulness as you do in your own research when you hear from allegations or make allegations. In a recent comment in Nature by Lewandowski and Bishop, they showed that we must be aware of orchestrated and well-funded harassment campaigns against legitimate research, and not only be aware of scientific misconduct per se, but also of obstruction or undermining science. For some kind of first aid kit for your purpose, the authors have identified 10 red flags areas that can help to differentiate between a healthy debate and problematic research practice and campaigns that are masqueraded as a scientific inquiry. So don't just think about the accusation against researchers, and if they're proven, always have a look at the critics as well. Are the allegations sufficiently defined, or which interest might be connected to the critic outside of scientific purpose. Coming to short overview about the thesis I made, scientific fraud or misconduct is connected to science research in the past and today and will be in the future. What message you might take along? Definitions of fraud or misconduct might change, but violations against scientific practice was not accepted either in the past nor today. It is a serious topic for the scientific community itself, but also for the general public. To repeat the main arguments, or simplified observation on scientific frauds and misconduct in history, there are only obvious frauds after they have been discovered, so it's hard to detect scientific fraud, even if it's very obvious. Thesis 2, the history of science misconduct is the start to learn about the implications in the future. It helps a little, sometimes a little more, to learn from historical scientific misconduct, not only primarily to do fraud better in the future, but to prevent it, hopefully. Third, communication in science is based on mutual respect. We use polite, we use neutral and exact language and terms. When it comes to scientific misconduct or fraud, the language and reactions might turn to harsh and exalted discussion, both in public and media, as well as in the scientific community. That's why be careful with the allegations of scientific misconduct. They might destroy reputation of both sides. So also apply carefulness and transparency if allegations of fraud or misconduct are made. That's why discussion of cases of scientific misconduct or fraud in a long historical perspective are particularly fruitful. No one of the accused researchers of fraud is very upset or will reply to you. In addition to this thesis, I want to bring another thesis. I didn't show you the related example today, but it helps to understand what might can do or seen as a starting point for yourself. Fraud in science is called by its time, meaning the definitions change. In the past, scientific fraud was very based on context, often reputation of the person, or sometimes just a little random. You, on the other hand, have the great opportunity to read hundreds of current definitions, clarifications, historical and current reports on misconduct and frauds, or ask colleagues, ombudspersons at institutions, ethics departments, and so on, to prevent allegations or sloppy science that can be seen as a scientific misconduct or fraud. Because there is a high chance that you will come in contact with this matter in some way in your long scientific career that lie ahead of you. So collect and get information beforehand. Thank you very much.